What up, world? This is Jake Tracy with Real Life Counseling of Northern Michigan. You have been listening to the interview about emotional intelligence with pastor of Community Reformed Church in Charlevoix, Michigan, Chip Sauer. And today is the third installment, part 3 of 3 of our interview. If you haven't listened to the first 2 parts, I encourage you to stop what you're doing right now before you jump into this one. Go back, listen to parts 1 and 2 of what Chip has to say because they are excellent. And once you've done that, here we go. The last part, emotional intelligence.
Life is meant to be for us is deep connection with the God that created us and the people in our life. And Adam and Eve, they stand there representing that truth, naked and not ashamed. Well, their disobedience, right? You just watch what then takes place. Shame enters the world, and shame becomes, I think, one of the most powerful influences in our lives today. It's why Brene Brown's stuff is so critically important in the conversation today. The church needs to hear what Brene Brown is saying, because she is able to express, I think, what is so fundamentally true about the power of the voice of shame and the impact of shame in our lives and keeping us from the life that God has for us. But look at what happens with Adam and Eve. When they disobey, the immediate result is they need to hide and pretend.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Fake it.
Right. They no longer believe that if they stand there as they are, that they will be loved and accepted. They have to put fig leaves on in order to be loved and accepted. You have to play the game. You have to embrace the false self. You have to put on the masks. And I think at its core, one of the fundamental things that's taken place that the voice of sin says, and all of us wrestle with this, is the voice of sin says, look, Jake, if people really knew you, they wouldn't love you.
Mm-hmm.
If they really knew the truth, all the skeletons in your closet, all that stuff that you think about, all that stuff that's been done to you or that you've done, if they really knew, they would run as far from you as they possibly could. And that's a lie. I mean, just think about how many times that you've been, maybe you've had it in your own experience or sat with kids where you made a decision or they made a decision to be incredibly vulnerable and they told you the truth. My dad sexually abuses me. I have addiction to pornography. Whatever it is, they were incredibly vulnerable. In that moment, what makes them feel so vulnerable is because they're afraid that rejection is going to come. But yet they recognize that this is something that is really hindering them in their life, so they're willing to surface it. And what often, it doesn't always happen in human relationships, but what I sure hope happens within the life of the church and with followers of Jesus is that you experience grace and acceptance, and that connects you more with that person than it pushes you away. The voice of shame screams in those moments that we consider being vulnerable. Don't do it, don't do it. You're going to be rejected. They're going to look down on you. You're going to be less than. You're going to always have this badge on you that they're going to kind of see you in a certain way. But that's just not true. What we keep in the darkness, right, continues to be like a cancer that grows. What we bring to the light has a chance of being restored and healed and redeemed.
Vulnerability before grace.
Yep.
Every time.
Yep. And so, I mean, that's just so important in this conversation of how we learn to love ourselves, that we recognize hearing it on Sunday mornings is helpful. It's a good reminder, but we need to experience it in our life. And the reality is, yeah, we experience God, but so often we experience God through people. We experience God's love through the love of people. We experience God's grace through the grace that people offer to us. We experience connection through the connections that we have in human relationships. It's the way that God designed us. I mean, one of the great ways that he loves us is he expresses himself in tangible ways through people in our life. And so, you just cannot grow without growing in your capacity to love yourself and to really see yourself through God's eyes, right? So self-compassion, self-kindness versus condemnation versus judgment versus self-loathing that's so prevalent within the life of the church and the way that people see themselves. Again, it goes back to those voices. Which voices have the most power and influence in your life? And I'm just, based on my experience, both personally and with others, and we wonder why people have such a hard time in their quiet time at times, or why it's so hard to be in solitude.
Stuff comes up.
Right. Those voices.
Right away.
Right. Those are the voices that you hear. Who wants to hear those voices? You suck. You're never going to amount to anything. You're not worthy of love and acceptance.
Yeah.
So I just think that's you just can't grow in what we're talking about in terms of emotional maturity and being who you are apart from that growth in terms of relationship with God, letting His voice be the voice that really has the most impact in defining who you are. I was just thinking about this the other day. At the core of who we are we? Sometimes the church is, I think a prevalent perspective is you're a sinner. That's not the core of who you are. Mm-mm. You're created in the image of God and you are deeply loved. At the core of who you are loved by God. Our sin separates us from experiencing that. And we need Jesus to be able to open the door for that relationship to be established for us. But at the core of who we are, we're not a sinner. That's part of our identity for sure. But at the core of who we are created in the image of God and deeply loved by Him. Whether we accept Him or not, whatever that's who you are. And sadly, that's a message the church has, I think, at times failed to express. We just have said, you're just bad. You're just wrong. You're just the sinner. That's who you are.
Yep. Preach it. If there's anything you would tell teenagers or parents, if every single teenager, every single parent could hear you on stage or hear what you're talking about, what's the one piece of advice? What's the one thing you would tell them? Yeah,
I would first speak to parents, and I would say that for what you offer to your child more than anything else is not techniques, is not reading books, it's not more data. It's you growing in your capacity to live in relationship with Christ, to love yourself, to really embrace who you are. And to live that out in front of your kids. That will have more impact than how you discipline and what books you read about parenting and what you do in terms of giving them an allowance, all of that. The who you are piece and how you learn to embrace Christ's love in your life and how you're willing to grow in that relationship. And you will not grow in that relationship apart from relationships with other people. So it's growing in being more authentic and vulnerable and courageous. It's being willing to ask for forgiveness from your kids, to tell the truth, to admit your shortcomings. That will have more impact in your kid's life than I think anything else.
Because nobody sees who you are more than your kids.
Exactly.
They pick up every little thing.
Yep, right. That's what I loved about youth ministry. Is kids' inauthenticity radars are incredibly good. If you fake it, they know it. There is no hiding the truth from kids for the most part in my experience. Whereas adults are professionals at playing that game. They fake it. They hide.
They have lots of experience.
Yep.
What would you say to teenagers trying to grow up in this world?
Mm-hmm. I think the message that I would want to express is here's what God says about you. Here's how God sees you. Here's what God says in His Word about how much He loves you and how He defines you. And it's a challenge to hear that, to believe that, to embrace that, and that you're going to be invited to see yourself in all sorts of different ways. The culture has all sorts of messages about how you find value and worth and how you're defined, and I would want to reiterate over and over and over again. I want to hand them something like this, that this is a collection of scripture that talks about who you are and defines who you are. And this is what I encourage you to believe is true. Because you're going to get all sorts of messages and all sorts of invitations. Mm-hmm. And I'd really encourage parents and kids to not go it alone. because I think most of us do. And it's one of the sad, and I would say to kids too, the church needs you, man. We need you so badly to help us see and be who we need to be. Because how you view, and especially the connection that so often kids have to the importance of relationships, and they haven't been inundated with the culture of church to the point that they're numb, and
Yeah.
I just think there's so much we have to.
They hold up a mirror so well.
Right, they do. Their
us.
voices are voices that we need to hear. So please don't give up on the church. Just be the ones that help the church become more of who it needs to be, because their voices are going to be so helpful in that.
Mm-hmm.
Because a vast majority of the churches that are present today are not going to be here in 15, 20 years. Because the small churches with the average age of 65, they're not going to be here in 20 years.
Last one to leave, close the door, turn the
Yeah,
lights off.
right.
That's it. I know. Well, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your time.
Yeah, for sure.
I love it. Tell me about these books. Give me these shout outs. You got a whole stack of them here. What are they all?
Yep. So I talked about the leader's journey. I think that I'd really encourage you to. So this one came out first, The Emotionally Healthy Church, and that's really good. There's a section in there. The whole book's good, but the section that I draw people's attention to are 6 principles of an emotionally healthy church. And I think there's so much here that is so beyond just the congregation, but is really personally helpful.
Okay.
And so I think this book, that content gained so much traction that he wrote this one.
Okay. So this is like the follow-up.
Yep, that's the follow-up.
The Emotionally Healthy Leader.
Yep. So I think that really goes deeper into what does it mean for us to grow in our capacity to be emotionally mature. And I really have appreciated what he's had to say. So are you familiar with Brene Brown?
No.
So yeah, I would encourage you to start with, I don't have a copy here, but it's called Daring Greatly. And I'd encourage you to read that book.
Daring Greatly
by Brene Brown. This is the follow-up to that. And then she has 2 books that she wrote previously. This is 1, and this is 2. These are really, this is her journey is a journey from, she's a researcher, and she decided to choose the topic of shame as her focus. So that first book, I Thought It Was Just Me, is the result of her research on women and the impact of shame. And because of what she then began to express and share, and it began to get out, she got confronted with men experience shame too. Mm-hmm. And so she changed her research and really began to focus comprehensively on the impact on shame in men and women. And so the gift of imperfection gets after kind of just some of the basic things that she found in the midst of that.
That's this next book.
Yep, that's the next one. And then Daring Greatly is so helpful in regards to how do we become more shame resilient. And one of the core things that she says is vulnerability. Are you familiar with TED Talks?
Oh yeah.
So I think she has, if not the most watched TED Talk, it's up at the top.
Really?
And it's The Power of Vulnerability. So
Okay.
I'd encourage you to watch that.
I'll search that and link that as well.
That will stir up, I think, a desire to read Daring Greatly. And then this is the most recent book that she has out, Rising Strong. And I can't say enough about how helpful. I mean, I am probably every other week I quote Brene Brown in my sermons.
Okay.
So she is just such an important voice.
Awesome.
And
I'm
then
going to go buy every single one of those books.
and then this one, and this is one of those books. This is Edwin Friedman. He no longer is alive. He didn't actually finish this book before he died, but it was with some help completed. This is kind of the summation of his work, and it's one of those books that is so rich. I'd encourage you, if you've got some folks in your life to read a book with, that you'd read it with them, especially if they're in the realm of leadership. I think this is probably in the top 2 or 3 books on leadership I've ever read.
Wow.
And he goes after, and I put some of I'll give you all of this. I don't want this, though. So I read this book with 5 other pastors, and we had Google Hangouts on it for about 6 months just to talk through it. But here is just a summation of some of the ideas within that book, so you may want to read that if that spurs on some stuff for you. But he says some things about leadership that really fly in the face of, I think, often what we think. Like, he goes after empathy in a way that I think is incredibly helpful, and it's part of what you as a counselor experience. So people come in my office, they want to talk about just the things that are hurting them, that are hard, that are broken, and I want to be a listening ear, and I want them to feel loved in the midst of that, and that they're not alone in the midst of what they're experiencing. But there's also a responsibility that we have to help them take responsibility for their brokenness. So it's a mess. You're experiencing a mess.
But you have to go fix it.
Well, it's what's your part in it?
Yeah.
So, how are you adding to the mess? And what does it mean for you to take a step forward and be more of who God's calling you to be in the midst of that? Well, that's not always well received. Because often the perspective of being a pastor or being somebody within the church is you just need to listen to me and care for me. Instead of being willing to say, really for this to move forward, you have to take responsibility. It's one of the key messages in our culture that Friedman goes after, is we live in a culture of irresponsibility. It's not my fault. Mm-hmm. I'm just a victim. It's their fault. It's Obama's fault. It's the Republican Party's fault. It's the pastor's fault. It's my wife's fault.
It's never my fault.
It's the Adam and Eve syndrome, right? Well, she gave me the apple, God. Come on. I'm not responsible. But he really goes after that, and I think he really has a helpful voice in regards to empathy. The other thing that he talks about, which I just have bought into, and in some ways I'm doing with you today, is the fallacy of data. So, right, once we implement this program that Willow Creek is doing, and you just got to read this book, and if you just read this book, but then there's another book, and then there's another book, and then there's another conference, and then there's another. And so it encourages us to always be looking for that silver bullet, but there's always more silver bullets. So we just keep reading, we just keep collecting information instead of you in your context saying, no, this is what I believe we need to do. This is what we're going to do. Together, this is how we're going to go about youth ministry in Petoskey. This is what we're going to value. I don't need to read another book. I don't need to collect more information. I don't need to wait for that resource to come out.
To save the day.
Right. Because what's so interesting about that, so let's say you read the book or you implement the 6-week DVD series and it doesn't work. Well, it's not my fault. We tried it. Didn't work. It must not be the right content. We need to look for something else instead of believing and trusting God's called you and equipped you. And yes, resources have a place, but we have put way too much stock in looking for the answer instead of doing the work of trusting God to help us. Because maybe there's not an answer, but maybe there's a journey, and this is the part of the journey that we need to be on for now. And this is what we're going to do. And maybe a year or two from now, we're going to be open to something different. Maybe we need to do something different. But we have to stop waiting. We have to stop grabbing a hold of getting somebody else to tell us what to do. I think that's a really helpful part of this book. But he's a little hard to read, and he's a little harsh. And sometimes the harshness, I think, is appropriate.
Okay.
But sometimes folks, so we're 6 pastors that are like, man, he's rough. He describes some of the conversations and interactions he's had with people, but I think this has been, this is one of the books that if you're in leadership, you got to read it.
Failure of Nerve,
Yep.
Edward Friedman.
Yep.
All right.
But again, I gave you some notes here that I think will kind of stir some of that up, including this is an overview of somebody else kind of wrote a little bit about the failure of nerve. And actually, this is a book written by a pastor who kind of took the next step and said, I read The Failure of Nerve. Here's how I interpret this within the life of the church. So he took the next step, and so this is really helpful too, but you should read The Failure of Nerve first.
Okay.
So let me see if there's anything else in regards to these. So the 8 concepts of Bowen theory, this is kind of going deeper into the conversation about seeing yourself clearly, and especially what this does is seeing yourself through the lens of your family of origin. We are who we are today due in part to our family of origin.
Oh, yeah.
And this really goes after, I think in a helpful way, how Bowen, one of the things that Bowen theory would suggest, you don't have to buy into it or not, but it would say that if you want your relationship with your wife to be all that it can be, you have to work on your relationship with your mom. That your relationship with her is directly impacting, in positive or negative ways, your relationship with your wife. And that doing some of the work in our relationships in our family of origin is one of the ways that we grow in our relationships currently. And I think there's some truth to that. I think I'm beginning to see that, especially my mom and my sister have a very difficult relationship, and I have always kind of been the mediator in that circle, and there's some work for me to do with my mom that I think will be important in terms of me being who I want to be with my wife. So I kind of buy into it, but he goes after that a little bit. And then Ron Richardson is a pastor who really has looked at church life through the lens of family systems, and that's the Bowen stuff. And it's just, to me, so helpful.
And that book is called
Creating a Healthy Church, Healthier Church. And he's got, I'm currently reading one he wrote, Becoming a Healthier Pastor. So, these aren't going to be on the top 10 list. You're not going to see these they're not John Ortberg or, that type of thing. But I just think this is stuff that's really helpful, especially as you get some knowledge base on family systems.
Wow.
Looking at what's going on, even in the high school, looking at the high school as a system or the middle school as a system, I think has really been helpful for me. So let me just see if I said everything regarding. Yeah, I just gave you, this is a little handout that we put together on anxiety. That's just kind of the basics of anxiety. I think that's really helpful. And then an article, just Jesus and the Differentiation of Self. This is by one of the authors of this book, wrote an article on this, so you might benefit from that.
Yeah, holy cow. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure.
What a joy.
Yeah, for sure.
Give me a lot of homework.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, I really appreciate your time, your wisdom.
Sure, Jake.
And,
so anything especially gets stirred up for you in this conversation? What stood out to you?
oh, man. I think that recognizing when anxiety is coming
Yeah,
and seeing that, it's coming.
yeah,
Am I going to respond with an emotional response, or am I going to respond with the kind of response, who am I?
yeah. Reflective
What kind
response.
of person do I want to be? A reflective response.
Yeah.
I really like that. And then also whose window? Jahari's window about not being afraid to be open with people and let people who love you.
Do you want
speak.
this?
Yep.
Is that?
Let people who love you speak truth into your life, and opening to that, even though it's absolutely terrifying to be vulnerable, because vulnerability is step one when you want to receive grace.
Yeah.
And that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of my experience in that is as I'm learning to let God be the one that defines who I am, right? So my identity is much more reflected in that little red book than is reflected in that false self that I've created, is that the opinions of other people are important, but that they're not near as important as they used to be. My wife's opinion is incredibly valuable. My closest friend's opinion is incredibly valuable. But the people that really don't know me, I'm okay with them not loving me or being a little bit more critical, because I know who I am. But if I don't know who I am, and my identity is so wrapped up in what everybody thinks of me, then everybody's voice carries more weight than it should.
Right. As opposed to the voice of, I am the light of the earth,
Yep.
I have eternal life,
Yep.
I have peace, I am loved by Jesus, I am loved by the Father, I
Yep.
belong to God, I am protected, I am sanctified.
Yep.
Those are the kind of things that we need to keep telling ourselves
Yep.
over and over, as opposed to, so-and-so doesn't think I'm good enough, so-and-so thinks I'm a jerk, so-and-so thinks I'm a bad
Yep.
fill in the blank.
Yep. And there's a whole story that we tell, isn't there? When we get criticism, one of our natural responses is to criticize back. Right? So we judge the crap out of people. Right? You don't like me? Well, I can think of all sorts of things about you I don't like now. Right? All of a sudden we start creating that disconnect in relationship, which is so different than that definition of the differentiation of self, which is remaining connected.
Despite what
You're
saying.
Right. Yep, that we don't, I saw this illustration at our denominational meeting where somebody did a little thing on conflict, and they talked about it, and it's kind of the anxious responses we talked about, but they illustrated it. So if we're in conflict, one of the ways that they just had two people stand there. Sometimes anxiety leads to, I step towards you, that's conflict. I run away, so I back up. But then there's the step toward you where it's all the pleasing thing. It's all about, so I'm feeling anxious and I flatter you. I'm so thankful for you and all that you've shared and how helpful that is, and it's false. Right? It's just, I want peace. You're mad, I want peace, and so I'm going to do anything I
do to get
right.
it.
I'm going to make you feel good about yourself. I'm going to please you. I'm going to say, "Oh, you're right. I'm wrong. I'm so thankful that you shared that with me," because my anxious response is leading. I just want us to be okay, and so we don't learn anything. We don't grow. I don't stand up for myself at all. But the picture that who we need to be is that we stand there. We don't step against. We don't step away.
We don't
stay,
sidestep the
right,
gossip.
Right,
right.
We stay who we are.
In the anxiety, in the tension.
It was super helpful just to see that illustration.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah.
I don't want to stand there in the tension. That's. Oh my goodness.
Well, that's where the work of who do you want to be is such an important part. And as we let God kind of help us see who we are and kind of give us that picture of how we can grow and who He's calling us to be, what we're designed for, that helps to answer that question that I think is so important.
I could sit at home and decide who I want to be and write goals and pray and remind myself that I'm beloved by God. Okay, this is who I want to be. But when the anxiety comes because I'm sitting across from somebody who is calling me out, it's a whole nother story. Am I going to reflect or am I going to react?
Yep, I think that's so true.
And that's the crux of emotional intelligence. Is emotionally intelligent people reflect and don't react to the anxiety in our life.
Yep.
Huh.
Yep, and it's hard. It's hard work. I'm tested on it every single day.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it too, is just the willingness to offer yourself grace along the way. That I'm a work in progress, because one of the voices that's in our heads is we're supposed to be perfect. One of the voices in our heads is we should have arrived by now. And so we play the beat ourselves up game anytime we fall short of who we want to be, and it's a fruitless game, and it is not helpful. It's not what God's saying. That's the beauty of forgiveness and the beauty of grace, is it covers us. End of story. That there is no value in replaying how bad you are, yet so many of us do that.
Good and perfect are at odds with each other.
Yeah.
Perfect is like Michelangelo's David. It's not going to change. It's not going to grow. This is as good as it can possibly be.
Yep.
It's dead.
Yeah.
But good, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it was good, and it was fruitful and multiplying. It was growing. It was moving somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's what we are called to be, is to be growing and to moving somewhere and becoming. And that's the good stuff.
Yeah, Matthew 5:48, which is in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount, there's this interesting sentence that I think has created all sorts of anxiety for Christians. It says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." And so we hear perfection and we hear impeccability. I never make a mistake. And we know that that's not true. We know the sinful nature remains. And so it seems like, what in the world does that mean? But the understanding in the Greek of that word perfect is, in a sense, a coming-of-age understanding. So be mature. Be, in the language I think that best fits that, is be whole. God has created you to be whole. In terms of wholeness and how you see yourself in your relationship with me as God, how you see yourself in a relationship with people in your life, how you're growing into the design that God has for you, that there's a sense of wholeness, mentally healthy, spiritually healthy, emotionally healthy, that's more of what that I think that text reflects, is that God has called us to wholeness. Not to the perfection that I never make a mistake, I never do anything wrong, that I think so often we spend time thinking about that's what that means. And I don't think that's what it means.
Interesting.
Yep.
It's good thoughts.
Yep. I think that's important, because that's another voice that I just have seen so prevalent in people's lives, is the voice of perfection. I'm a failure. I didn't do it perfectly. And then I beat myself up for it. And the outcome of that is not helpful. The impact of that is not good. Okay, I promise I'll be done talking.
I'll turn that off. Chip, Community Reformed Church, thank you so much.
Yeah,
what a
of course,
joy.
Jake.
What
Yeah.
a joy.